All right, so uh, David Hume, right, and principle-based moral theories. So principle-based moral theories are ones that are normative in nature, meaning that they express some standard of uh, thought, right? Either one that should be adhered to for morality, either some standard that morality should be adhered to, or by nature does, right? Um, some rule that morality follows. Right? So Hume was a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and he wrote a book entitled A Treatise of Human Nature. Right? Um, and this book was composed of three different parts. Right? The first book was, well, three different books, as it were. Right? Book one, the first part, deals with epistemology and metaphysics. Now, Hume was a naturalist, right? He was basically an early form scientist before the term science really became coined, right? And not just in the way that the natural philosophers of, ancient Greece were, but like true blue, he references, Robert Boyle and his laws of thermodynamics and his laws. He looks at the structure of the eye. He looks towards animals and things like that. Uh, if he'd been alive and doing his work at the time that Darwin had published The Origin of the Species, Hume would have made use of it. Right? And that's the type of philosopher that he was. One that was far more in line with a modern day scientist in certain respects than others are. Now, Hume uh, still did philosophy in the speculative form, though, right? Where a lot of his thinking is informed by just thinking things through and forming logical connections. And Book One very clearly exemplifies this. In it, Hume posits a naturalistic metaphysics, um, which says there's nothing but what can be observed in the physical world, right? Even our minds and the feeling that we have that the mental is something different from the physical, he says, is a product of the physical. Right? And one of the most important things that comes out of this book, there are two particularly important arguments that come out of book one of the treatise. But one of the most important ones is the idea that there is no necessary connection between events, right? And necessary connection is what Hume is the phrase Hume uses to talk about strict causation, right? Strict causation is if A happens and if A then B, right? In every cases, right? So A, therefore B, right? Basic deductive reasoning. He says that we can't assume that strict causation occurs because we rely on observation to create our knowledge base, right? And as individuals, limited in time, space, and time and space, we can't see every similar instance happening at once to determine that something is a universal law or not. So the idea that cause and effect, that if I take this pen and if I let this pen go, that it will fall, right? The idea that that is a universal law, right, isn't something that we can conclude according to Hume. Right? There might be a situation that we're not aware of that I take this pen, let it go, and it just floats. For example, if we were on the International Space Station, that would be the case. Um, what laws are, right? Causal laws, according to Hume, are nothing more than what he calls constant conjunction, right? We do is we perceive a whole bunch of similar situations, right? Not the exact same pen being dropped many times and things falling, but we see all sorts of things like a cat knocking a water bottle off of a table, off of a table, and the bottle falling. Right? Person tripping and their keys going flying as they lose their grip and then falling to the ground. We see similar situations, A and B in close connection, right? Someone has a grasp of something, or something is supported, and then it's not, and it falls to the ground, right? When something's no longer supported, it falls to the ground, right? So A and B. We see those things in close connection to each other, constantly in close proximity. And we create in our minds the idea, based off of those impressions, that there is a general rule that for gravity, right? That if I let go of something, it will fall. And that's what it is, right? We go from many particular instances to broad universal generalizations, right? Um, and this winds up having a place in his analysis of morality, right? And specifically his argument against moral laws as like the basis of morality. So book 2 is where he shifts to talking about emotion and its place in thought, as he calls it. And book 2 is called the passions, right? So he calls the emotion the passions, right? So according to Hume, the passions are the basis of sentiments, right? Things like sympathy, anger, pity, humility, right? And kindness, things like that. And those sympathies are the basis of our more general moral judgments. And it's therefore the passions that inspire us or impel us to act morally, right? We act from a place of emotion when we're making a moral judgment. So as he puts, what this means is that our reasoning is not. We like to believe that we can control our emotions, right? That we can surmount our emotions with reason. That's kind of even that's there even in sort of Aristotle's framework for the virtues, right? We have a feeling, and we use the use of phronesis to exercise over that feeling, and determine what the proper course of action is, right? Temper the feeling, and either by stoking it or pushing it down to an appropriate level, and choose the course of action after that, right? Um, so reason controlling emotion. But Hume takes this idea and he inverts it. He says that reason is and properly ought to be the slave of the passions. Right? Our reasoning is dictated and shaped by our emotions, not the other way around. So our emotions shape not just reasons, but desires too. And included amongst these desires are the sentiments, right? And are more to the point, are moral judgments. For this reason, the further away we get from uh, events that directly affect us, right, the harder it is to remain impassioned about them, right? To maintain like a moral vigor. We can see this in like how the Black Lives Matter demonstrations died down mere weeks after, like within a month, right? Even if we all feel that as a general moral principle, this should be something that gets done and gets focused, right? The demonstrations have died down, right? Because we've become more and more removed from the original event that ignited the flame for the demonstrations. It's not that we don't think these things or have a general moral principle that says that this is right, this is wrong, right? And Black lives should be valued equally. But what it is we're we've gotten further and further distance from the source of ignition, and that has led to the fire sort of dying down. The people who are directly affected by those instances are still out there, still protesting, um, just as vigorously. But you don't see the same level of crowds because the people who aren't as directly affected, for whom it doesn't hit home, um, the passion has kind of died down to a degree. Uh, so there needs to be like something to stoke it to reignite those protests if we want to see that same level of turnout. This would be Hume's justification of it. Right? And we see this kind of like in the sense of how things that are closer to home in the very real way, in the very literal sense, wind up affecting how we um, think about and act on uh, those moral sentiments, right? If something directly affects our family, it directly affects us, and therefore the sentiments are very strong, right? Uh, the same thing. If someone wrongs one of our friends, even if we weren't there, we feel very strongly on the part of our friends. We feel indignant on their behalf, right? We feel anger for them, sympathy for them, pity for them, right? And we feel it very, very strongly. If someone breaks into our neighbor's house, right, even if we're not on good terms or really talk with our neighbors, we feel, we feel for them in that moment because their close physical proximity means that it's something that could have affected us too, right? And maybe that might sound a little bit selfish, but it's just kind of a natural sort of that was almost me thinking, right? Which is perfectly natural. That's not morally wrong. That's not. It's not like a wrong sort of reaction. Something you should be chastised for, um, so long as you don't stay in that mode of thinking. And that was a personal sort of tangent there. Um, but then you get into general ideas like child labor is wrong, sweatshops are wrong, inhumane working conditions should not exist, right? And we believe these as sort of general moral principles, very, very general, right? Ones that expand out from our own personal values into general moral laws. But what happens is when we think about the child sweatshops in Thailand, right? And Cambodia, where 90% of your clothes are made, right? There are a lot of your clothes are made in sweatshops by children, right? Um, but we don't feel so strongly about that. I mean, we might feel strongly about the idea, but it doesn't impel us towards action because it's so distant from us, right? So this is what he means, right? And becomes the focus of book 3, how we go from the specific moral passions, right? Or the specific passions and moral sentiments, and how those grow into general moral norms in a society, right? And this also accounts for all the different moral norms that we wind up having, right? How different societies can have different ideas of what right and wrong are, and it comes from like values being enforced kind of by the environment to a degree. Um, so one last thing, Hume's moral theory is what's known as a descriptive account of ethics, right? It does not presume to tell us how ethics should be done or how we should moralize and make ethical judgments. It just says this is how we do ethics. This is how we make moral judgments. Right? It's the natural shape of our moral thinking already. Right? He does present a couple of ideas towards the end of book 3 on how we uh, ought to moralize, but for the most part, his account is descriptive rather than prescriptive. Um, Kant, who we're going to talk about next, is, by contrast, very much a prescriptive moral theorist with his deontology.